Alright, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be our next video on evolution, and today we're going to be comparing DNA. Let's get started on this next video. So comparing DNA, let's go through and look at this. Darwin could compare only the anatomy and embryos of living things, and today scientists can compare their DNA. And this DNA has given us insight into how humans and then all species have gone through and evolved. So if we look at this cladogram here, what we're able to see is based on the DNA evidence, we can see that similar sequences are the strongest evidence for evolution from a common ancestor. The more similarities in the DNA sequence there are, the more evidence and closer the evolutionary relationship it provides. So we can see based on this cladogram that each individual is related genetically, and what we can do is extract their DNA and compare the DNA sequences to better understand their phylogeny. Now, if we are understanding biochemistry here, we can understand a few things. So let's look at human cytochrome C. And this is an identical protein that we're going to see in chimpanzees. Now, what we can see from this is yeast, wheat, and primates are actually going to have this cytochrome C, and this is a protein, and we can look at the amino acid sequence so we can go through and compare it amongst these species here. Now, as we go through and delve into this, ancient ancestors of the species developed a gene for cytochrome C, and ever since the wheat, the chimp, and the yeast diverged from one another, what we see are small changes in the amino acid and protein sequence. So if we're looking at this here, what we're seeing here is we're seeing each of the amino acids lined up among the protein here, and we can see how the proteins are going to be slightly different amongst organisms. So if we look at the yeast here, the yeast and the wheat are a little bit different than the primate, but all primates have exactly the same amino acid sequence amongst chimps, gorillas, and humans, because they are so close to each other on this evolutionary tree, or if we're looking at it based on the evolutionary divergence here. So by zooming in here, what we see is we can see the yellow is going to represent the identical sequences, and then the green represents a different in the sequences. And what we're going through and looking at here is the change in the sequence of these amino acids. The more changes there are, the more divergent that organism is from whatever we're going through and comparing it. So we can see the first 5 amino acids are all very similar, but then we see a change in the amino acid sequence amongst yeast, wheat, and the primates here amongst all 3 of those individuals. And as we go through the amino acid sequences here, we can go through and use this to determine how closely related the organisms are and whether or not they've diverged recently in time or far away in time. The more amino acid sequences we see that are different, the further back in time there's been a divergence of those organisms. And the closer the amino acid sequences are to each other, well, the more closely the organisms are related and their common ancestor is somewhere further up in time or somewhere in recent history. So if we look at this, the equivalent protein found in yeast is going to differ by about 56 amino acids when we're going through and comparing it to the primates. And then if we look at it in wheat, well, the equivalent protein in wheat differs only by about 18 amino acids. Remember, we're using these sequences of amino acids to go through and determine how related organisms are amongst each other. And remember, each of these proteins is affected by the DNA. Now, if we go a little bit further, we can talk about the molecular clock, and this is specifically going through and looking at DNA nucleotide sequences here. So the molecular clock is an idea that shows how DNA mutates slowly over time in a clock-like rhythm. So let's say we're looking at these species here, and we have an individual here. This is species 1. We're going to have species 2. We're going to have species 3 here. And as we go along these species here, what we're seeing is a nucleotide sequence changes here. So we can see the difference if we're just looking at 1 and 2 here. There's been 2 changes over time from species 1 to species 2. And those 2 changes are going to affect the amino acid sequence. And remember, the proteins are what make up the phenotype, and they're physically what is going to change that organism. Now, if we go to species 3, what we're going to see with species 3 is, well, there's going to be potentially more amino acid sequence changes here. And remember, the yellow circles are representing differences, the mutations referred to or reference to when we're talking about species number 1. The more similar the code to number 1, the more closely related the two species are. So as we go along with these species here, what we can see is all of these nucleotide sequence changes amongst all of the species. And because of that, remember, the more closely, if we have similar codes to number 1, the more closely related it is. But as we go on through time, and as that divergence goes through and happens, and as the more mutations, or as the more times these nucleotides change, the more dissimilar the species are. So lastly, we can go through and look at species number 6 here, and we can see that there are more and more nucleotide sequences going through and changing, and because of this, species 6 is not very closely related to species 1. Now, species 2 only has 2 nucleotide sequence changes, same with species 3, so they are much more closely related to species 1 than compared to species 6, 5, and 4. And as we go down here, we can see the more distant they become as we go down and see species with more nucleotide sequence changes. So DNA is going to be a really important tool for understanding how all species are related. And what we can go through and do is we can create these giant evolutionary trees and these phylogenetic trees that allow us to go through and look at all of the species on Earth. And we can go through and create these trees based on the DNA evidence we have. So by sequencing DNA for all organisms, we can look at those nucleotide sequence changes. And by looking at those nucleotide sequence changes, we can compare how closely or not closely related organisms are. Now, scientists in all different evolutionary branches are going to use DNA sequencing, and they're going to use a variety of different techniques to go through and determine how related organisms are. And based on these sequences and based on microsatellite repeats, which we'll talk about in our biotechnology section, we can see a variety of different things and see how related the organisms are and how they've evolved over time. So DNA is really the most clear and most definitive way of us going through and looking at how organisms change, because we can go through and track the precise mutations that occurred over time. And remember, those precise mutations affect what the organisms look like, because those sequences code for amino acids, which make up the proteins which make the organism what it is. So by looking at the foundation, the DNA, as well as the amino acids, what we're able to see and what we're able to determine from this is how organisms have evolved over time in a very concise and definitive way. So another large question or common misconception that we have is humans evolved from these monkeys, apes, chimpanzees over time, and the organisms that we see on Earth today are the organisms that we've evolved from. And this is a little bit more complicated and not really true. So due to billions of years of evolution, humans share genes with all living organisms. And what we see is all organisms on the Earth are related to us in one way or another. It just depends on how far back on the phylogenetic tree we go. And remember, we're using the genes and the DNA to basically record the similarities. And that's what we just went through and talked about with the molecular clock. So the more genes with organisms, the more genes that we share with organisms, the more closely related those organisms are to us. So we belong to a biological group known as primates, and we are classified within the Great Apes section. And one of the major groups. So besides similarities in the anatomy and behavior, our close biological kinship with other primate species is indicated by the DNA. And it's going to confirm that our closest living biological relatives are actually chimpanzees, and we share many of the same traits with them. But the thing we have to understand here is we did not directly evolve from any primates that are living today. If we zoom into the phylogenetic tree here, the last common ancestor when humans and chimps went through and diverged lived 8 to 6 million years ago. We did not evolve from gorillas, orangutans, any of the apes, any of the monkeys that we see here that are living today. There's a common ancestor that occurred somewhere 8 to 6 million years ago. And if we go back between going and looking at monkeys and apes here, it's longer than that. It's 25 million years ago. And that common ancestor no longer exists. So when individuals say, well, we have evolved from orangutans, gorillas, and chimpanzees, that's not necessarily true. We do share a common ancestor about 8 to 6 million years ago when that divergent event took place, but we did not evolve from any of the apes or any of the primates that we see today. Alright, so did you guys learn? Well, did you learn a couple of things? Did you guys go through and learn about comparing DNA among organisms and how these organisms can be related? Did you guys go through and understand biochemistry, go back to biochemistry and understand how we can look at sequences of proteins to go through and look at phylogeny of organisms? And then did you guys learn about the molecular clock and how we're using specific sequences in the DNA to go through and determine how closely related organisms are? This is going to be the end of the video. I will see you all in class tomorrow.